Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready? Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good whatever time of the day it is that you happen to be tuning in to this podcast. My name is John, the lead pastor of Coram Deo Church, and I, once again, will be your host on The Blitz. Today, our topic is masked fear. Not mass fear, but masked fear. And I think this may be one of our shorter ones. We'll see how it goes here. If you don't already know, which I'm sure you do know by the time this thing gets aired, the CDC recently changed its mind on COVID and announced what I think the vast majority of people who have a decent amount of common sense knew, which was that it makes no sense to be vaccinated and have to be also masked up. And so the CDC announced their new guideline was that if you have been vaccinated, you do not need to be masked. Now, I'm not going to get into the issue of vaccination here or now, maybe at a later time, but not today. I want to just talk about the new announcement that if you've been vaccinated, you do not need to mask. Once the CDC released this advisory, released the statement, Jay Inslee, the wonderful governor of Washington State, he had a press conference in which he announced that in light of the CDC's recommendations that the great people of the state of Washington who have been vaccinated would no longer need to mask. Now, lay aside the issue of how in the world do you enforce that? That is an unenforceable mandate. It's just absolutely ridiculous, but we're not going to go there. He said if you're vaccinated, you don't need to mask. Now, there's some very interesting things I think that need to be observed because throughout this whole COVID time, which I can't wait until we're not talking about this anymore, or don't have to talk about it, but throughout this whole time, there have just been blatantly really weird inconsistencies that make no sense, and they really make no sense when they're coming from organizations or governors who keep saying science, science, follow the science, it's about the science. So, to give you a little backdrop here, Jay Inslee, just a couple weeks before he made the announcement that if you're vaccinated, you do not need to wear a face mask, he announced that some of the counties in Washington State were in danger of going back to phase 1. That's basically go in your hole and hide the plague is floating in the air. Don't be around people, no gatherings, none of that. He actually said there were some counties in danger of going back to phase 1. He said clearly that he was concerned about a fourth wave of COVID hitting our state and that we needed to be vigilant and do everything we can to resist. And a couple days later, he said, hey, if you've been vaccinated, take your mask off. Right? So he went from, it's good to wear a mask and you need to be vaccinated. In fact, as you drove around the roads in Washington state highways and stuff, they have those reader boards to let you know that there's an accident above, or if someone's been kidnapped or something has happened, they tell you, they give you a heads up on that. And these reader boards were saying, mask up, even if you're vaccinated. Okay, so we went from mask up, even if you're vaccinated, and we might go back to phase 1, and a fourth wave's coming, and get ready to bunker down, to if you have been vaccinated, you don't need a mask anymore. And some people have asked, like, hey, where's the science on that? And, good question. Don't hold your breath on a good answer to that. It's just all kind of been ridiculous. And it's really been ridiculous from the very beginning. I hate to belabor this and keep saying it, but we need to remember the nonsense that we've been subjected to. Now, when I say nonsense, I'm saying the governor mandating things. People who choose to take protective measures of their own will and liberty, okay, that's fine. But what the governor is mandating this whole time has just been absolutely insane. Like the notion that if 5 people sit down in a coffee shop together to enjoy some coffee and conversation and food, that's fine. But the moment a 6th person shows up, COVID just starts squirting everywhere and everybody's going to get infected and die. Or the idea that when you're sitting at the table with your 5 friends, or maybe a 6th friend, depending on how generous the governor's feeling, you're totally fine. But the moment you stand up, COVID starts secreting from all of your face, your sweat glands. It just goes everywhere. And it's just like, this just doesn't make any sense. I can't make any sense of this. And that's just been kind of the deal since April, just trying to figure this stuff out. So this has just been kind of a roller coaster of a ride, a really crazy ride. I'm very thankful that I think my take on the change in the mask requirement is essentially this, that especially the liberal governors and maybe the CDC as well, there's just an acknowledgement that people aren't buying this nonsense anymore and they're fed up. And the governing authorities were losing the battle. Nobody is listening. People are increasingly ignoring these mandates, and I think rightfully so. And I think the announcement that came out this last week had more to do with saving face and acknowledging that they've lost control of the narrative. People are no longer giving into this nonsense, and rather than saying, okay, we realize you guys don't want to listen and you figure this out, I think this is kind of like the exit strategy for them to save face, so they can claim science and they can rapidly move forward to opening things, which is really the only way I can understand Jay Inslee saying 4th wave's coming, we might have to go to back to phase 1, and then literally like 2 weeks later saying, hey, we're going to fully open Washington on June 30th or earlier if more people get vaccinated. That there is no science to that. It's just arbitrary nonsense. So all that being said, I want to talk about what I think we are going to be dealing with. I think many people are dealing with it in a more perhaps personal, private way, but I think it's going to become more publicly obvious as guidelines and mandates and restrictions are loosened, and that is what I want to call masked fear. Okay, when this stuff started to hit the fan last year, I had a conversation with a medical professional friend, highly educated, spooky smart person who has been practicing medicine for a long time. And one of the things that, or a couple of things that they said to me was, one, this just doesn't make sense. The way this is being handled, the measures that are being taken, this does not make sense from a scientific standpoint. And the other thing he said is that this is going to tap into people's fears. And once we get into this world of mask mandates, it's really going to be hard for people to get out of it because of the mass pandemonium, the panic, the fear that this taps into, and the fear narrative that was being sold by the media and by a lot of our elected officials and people in government positions. He said fear is going to be a big issue. And I think what we are going to see in the coming weeks and months, in fact, I think I'm already seeing it. I think what we're going to see is fear driving people's decisions, fear driving the way that people conduct their lives, fear driving things that people are doing as it pertains to COVID and to masks. So let me just share kind of a really interesting experience I had over the weekend. I went shopping to a couple of places, and I went in knowing that the mask mandate had been dropped, and so I went in and I didn't have a mask on, and I was the minority. Like I think in 3 different shops or 4 different major stores that I went to, I maybe saw one other person without a mask. Now, you can go to the Kitsap County Health website and see the vaccine doses that have been administered in our county, and the number it's massive. I mean, there have been a large number of doses in the state and a very large number of doses in our own community. I think Kitsap County is somewhere around 280,000 people, and I think the doses were around 200,000 or maybe a little north of that. I don't remember the exact number, but there are a lot of people who have been vaccinated who are still walking around with masks. So I'm going to make a statement here, and this doesn't apply to everybody, but I think it does apply to a good number of people. I think what is going to be exposed and be revealed, and people are going to have to deal with, and we're going to have to figure out how do we deal with this, is that people who said they were we're submitting to the governing, and I'm speaking specifically to Christians, we're submitting to the governing authorities because of Romans 13, and I've already done podcast about that and how that doesn't work. But we're doing that, and we're trying to submit to the mandates and the recommendations and all that. Now that those mandates and recommendations are no longer there, people are going to continue to follow these guidelines that they had been following. People are going to continue to practice as if we're in phase 1 or phase 2 or phase whatever, even when the mask thing is dropped. And I think what that exposes is what I think is a very widespread issue that now is going to be brought to the surface, and that is that though a lot of people appeal to science and a lot of people appeal to the governor, now that science and the governor are changing, that fear that was in people's hearts and in their minds, and I would say I think a lot of that is very irrational. If you look at the data, if you look at the numbers, I think a lot of fear is just it just is not in line with reality. But I think a lot of that fear, a lot of what we're going to see is that fear is going to be dominating people's lives. So people who have said, I'm just following the science, now that the science says you're vaccinated, you don't need a mask, they're still going to mask, and they're still going to distance, and they're still going to take these measures as if we're still in this, season of pandemic, even when that season is over. And the reason for that is fear. It's masked fear. That fear has been hiding behind governor mandates. That fear has been hiding behind the science and this report or that report and the CDC. But all along, I wonder if it wasn't about the mandates and it wasn't about the governor and it wasn't about the CDC, but it was about fear. And here's what you need to understand. Fear destroys liberty and free fear destroys freedom. Fear controls and destroys our life. Listen to the wisdom of Proverbs chapter 29 verse 25. The fear of man lays a snare, right? The fear of man lays a snare. When we fear things more than we fear God, when God is not ultimate, when he is eclipsed by other things, when our hearts are caught up with analytic statistics and numbers, and when we cling on to fear, it says it's a snare. What does that mean? Part of what it means is it's a trap. It's a trap. Once you buy into fear, you find yourself trapped and you find yourself stuck. You can't get out. The fear, the spring, the mechanism of fear, it's been sprung. It's got its grip on you. And now you're like the mouse that can't get away from the trap. The fear of man lays a snare. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to see a lot of people who are stuck in this snare, that are captivated by fear. And the question is, how do we navigate? How do we walk out of that? I think there's two things that are going to have to happen. I think that there are a number of people, and I'm not talking about this in a corporate sense. I'm talking about this in a much more, personal sense. But people who have been saying it's about the science, it's about the science, it's about the science, and now that the science says something else, and they're not able to change, I think there's going to have to be some personal confession going on between friends. I'm not talking like widespread confession. I'm not talking about like church discipline type stuff. I'm saying, but people who are captivated by fear, they're going to have to start speaking openly and honestly about that. They're going to have to talk with their friends about it. I think pastors are going to have to deal with the issue of fear and the snare of fear, because once you get stuck in the grips of fear, it is not easy to get out. And over the past year, so much of the narrative, so much of the story has appealed to our, maybe for many people it was hidden fears that were internalized, things that they dealt with but maybe weren't as vocal about. But this opportunity allowed fear to just take over, and that trap has sprung. And so people are going to need help. And in Proverbs it says, the fear of a man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. And what that means is that this inordinate fear is not a morally neutral thing. Fear of man, an inordinate fear, is contrary to trust in the Lord. We are either given to irrational fear and the fear of man, or we trust the Lord. Those things don't mutually exist. They don't happen together. Now, for sure, we struggle. We go back and forth. But the remedy to being released from fear that dominates us is not better science, and it's not better numbers, and it's not mandates, and it's not guidelines. And because what you're going to see is those things are going to go roll out, and people are still going to be living in fear. The remedy to that fear is to trust in the Lord. That is our refuge. That is our safety. And I wonder how much this last season has exposed the ways that we do not trust in the Lord. Because either we are subject to the fear of man, in irrational fear, and it is a snare and it traps us, or we trust in the Lord. So that's all I've got to say about masked fear. We will see what happens in the coming weeks and coming months. Right now, Jay Ainsley says June 30th is the latest date that the state of Washington will reopen. It will be interesting to see how people in our community adapt to these guidelines. Will people return to normal, or will they be stuck in fear? We will see that together. Regardless of what happens, know this: the fear of man lays a snare. You do not need to be afraid of man. You do not need to be afraid of the statistics. You can be aware of them. You do not need to be fearful. Why? Because those who trust in the Lord are safe. All right, thanks for joining me on this episode of The Blitz. Hope you had a great time, and we will see you next time. Peace out.